Hi, Joe. How are you?
Hello, Abby. I'm good. I am recovering from having my brain melted by the worst game ever that you made me play.
I'm sorry about that.
It,
Not really.
It's definitely not the worst game ever by anyone's standards, but it was frustrating in a enjoyable way, but a very particular way. And I don't know how we're going to talk about it without spoilers, but I feel like you could hear people talk about this game for 45 minutes and go away and play it and still have a very similar experience to what we had, right?
Yes, I think that's true. What we're going to do today is we're going to doge about an inter-Afghan Harcourt.
Uh-huh.
Which totally makes sense, right?
We're going to doge.
We're going to doge.
I vaguely remember what some of these words mean.
No.
We've talked before on the show about constructed languages, right?
Mm-hmm.
But every time we've encountered constructed languages, they are in the context of a game where the game is in English, and then there's a constructed language within the game that's like a puzzle, but the entire game isn't in that language, right? Because why would you do that? That would be terrible to...
That would be torture.
That would be torture to make people play a game entirely in a constructed language. And yet, here we are, and that's what we've been doing.
Yeah. Today we're going to talk about a game called the Gostak.
Yeah, an inter-Afghan Harcourt called the Gostak.
Sorry.
Yeah, which came out in 2001
Mm-hmm.
by someone called Carl Muckenhoupt. And how did you find out about this Harcourt?
By doing some very sophisticated research on Google and typing text adventure about made-up languages or something like that.
And I think our different backgrounds make this a particularly interesting one to look at, right? Because you're a linguist, and although you're a gamer, you don't have much history with interactive fiction.
No,
right?
So this is the first text-based game I've ever played, which is not the best game to play for a beginner.
Yeah, if you go on the interactive fiction database, all of the reviews of this are like, this should not be the first game you play, because I mean it relies on knowing the conventions of the genre, right?
We're going to get to that. Yeah, would you introduce the game a little bit more, maybe, and talk about when I say text-based adventure game? Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah. So the Gostak it came out in 2001, and we've had text-based games going all the way back to like the late 70s, and the Gostak is an example of something called parser-based interactive fiction. So if you imagine you've got an interactive fiction game and it describes the world to you. You are in a room, you can go north, south, east, west, blah, blah, blah. And the way that these always used to work, even in the sort of early 80s, the early ones that I played when I was a kid, was you type in what you want to do. You type in look at cat, or get cat, or throw cat. And then the game sort of tries to interpret what you're trying to tell it to do, and then it carries out an action. And that's what we now call parser-based interactive fiction. You are typing into this little flashing line, and that's the parser. It's trying to parse what you are telling it to do. In more recent years, I would say going back to about 2010, we get the popularity of something called Twine, which is it's kind of lauded as being a really easy way for people to get into making games. I don't necessarily agree with that, because I played with it and it was still quite challenging to make things in. But that is hyperlink-based interactive fiction. So you're still looking at a game that is entirely text-based.
Yeah.
But instead of typing in what you want to do, you're just sort of clicking on options. So it's much more like playing a visual novel, like a Phoenix Wright game or something like that, where a story is happening and then you get 3 options to choose from, and that progresses the story. Whereas,
so in terms of what the player gets to do, the options are much more limited and straightforward. Whereas for the parser-based ones, you as the player have to figure out, okay, what actions can I even do in this world? And then a lot of it is trial and error, right? Can you throw the cat? And the game might tell you you can't, right?
Yeah, exactly. And And if you think about it, like the parser has to cater for everything you could want to do. Like the more it does that, the kind of more believable the world is. And it might achieve that through a bunch of different ways. So, for example, if you try to eat something, if you try to eat an object, the programmers either are going to like decided how that interacts with every possible object in the game, or they might have created some sort of tag for objects to say whether they're edible or not, right? So you might have objects that, and this is just me theorizing about how the programming might work, but the way that this would generally work is you would have certain objects that have an attribute that is edible, just like in the real world, we attach these kind of language tags to things. That's edible, that's not. And then that is likely to change how the game responds to you trying to eat something. Now, you might have something that's tagged as edible and also deadly poisonous. So it's like you can eat that, but then you'll die. I remember when I was a kid, I had the Lord of the Rings text adventures on tapes and The Hobbit as well. And the amount of interactions in those games that were in there that were just like, why did they put this in here? Because I remember, and this will give you an insight into what sadistic 8-year-old Joe was like. I remember the part in Lord of the Rings where you're traveling with Gollum, and I tied him up because we had some rope, and that's what you do. And then I fed him salt.
Oh my God.
And if you feed him too much salt, if you feed him salt like 5 times in a row, he dies.
Well, that's what happens.
I guess it depends on the volume of salt that you consume. But that was just one of those moments where I sort of I'd done some programming as a kid with these types of games, and I had an understanding of like the complexity of building these interactions. So my mind was completely blown that the programmers had thought to make, unhealthy salt intake a parameter in their interactive fiction, or as it's called in the language of the Gostak, an indirect. So this is a game where it's in that parser-based thing where you are typing in what you need to do, which makes the central conceit of the game even more challenging because you're not just learning to read its language, you're also having to communicate everything you want to do. So there are some words that are in English, like all of the connective words, like to and with and in English. And then everything that is a noun or a verb.
Or an adjective.
And I don't think we really get adverbs. I think I saw some things that looked like adverbs, but I never worked out what they were.
But so you have all the lexical words, basically, right? Nouns, verbs, adjectives. If you look at a sentence, they look like nonsense words. But the grammar is what would be standard English grammar. So the syntax, which is the structure of a sentence, would be standard English syntax. And so just to give you an example, I think...
Well, can I read the little introductory bit that you start off with before we get into like the history of with the phrase and stuff? So when you first load up this game or story, you get the information of who wrote it and everything. You're told it's an indirect, which we can kind of infer the meaning of based on what we might see in other games of this type when we first look at it. And then finally, here you are at the Delcott of Tondam, where Dosh is Deve. But the Doshery Lut is crend with clouds. Clouds! How warm it would be to pell back to the Buell and distunk them. Distunk the whole Delcott, let the Drokes discrend them. But you are the Gostak. The Gostak distims the Doshes, and no Gloud will vol them from you. And obviously I'm putting intonation on this, which makes it sound more like real stuff than it may be. But the words that are there and the words that we already know from English do sort of create this implied meaning that allows you to put this intonation on it, right?
And it's not just the words that are there, but it's the word order. So, and this brings us back, or brings me to how this game came about in the first place. And it's all rooted in this one sentence that Joe just read, which is the Gostak distims the Doshes. Now, the person who made this game did not come up with that one sentence. The Gostak distims the Doshes. That's actually a sentence that was made up by a not really well-known educator and teacher named Andrew Ingraham, who, amongst other things, was principal of a school in America called Swain School, and he gave lectures at that school, which were later on published, specifically in 1903. And one of the chapters in that book is called 9 Uses of Language. So he talks about language and communication. And he came up with this sentence, the Gostak, the stims, the doshes. Basically, the point of that is to say, well, if you have a sentence like that, even if you don't know what the individual words mean, like Gostak and the stims, if you're familiar with the overall syntax and you can recognize that's English syntax, you can still draw conclusions about certain properties of the words and what they mean, right? So you can tell, for instance, that the Gostak is the one doing the stimming, and the doshes are the ones who are being distimmed. So you can tell that distims is a verb, and that the Gostak is the subject, the one doing it, and that the doshes are the direct object, right? The ones being distimmed. So you get some kind of information about those words and what they refer to without having to know what any of them actually mean, just from the syntax.
This person we're talking about, Ingraham, they're not necessarily someone that's like recognized as being a historical linguist or whatever, but this is a really good example of a linguistic phenomena, which is the way that you can infer meaning from structure, right?
Yeah, and that example was later on actually picked up by 2 much more well-known linguists named Ogden and Richards.
Yeah, it's in 1923, so it's 20 years after he coined this term.
Yeah, they wrote the book The Meaning of Meaning, and that's quite well known. They sort of somehow they found this book with the lecture by Ingraham and used that example. And I mean, in a way, Ingraham wasn't the first one to notice that kind of thing. You might have heard of the poem The Jabberwocky, which appears in Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, which is basically also the same kind of nonsense poem with nonsense words, but using English syntax, and therefore you can make sense of it, right?
And there's another thing that's a separate thing from what we're talking about here, but there's like the Kiki Baba sort of implied meaning of the phonetics going on here, where if you hear Brillig, it's sort of like you kind of think that might be a weather descriptor of like chilly or like which is totally separate from what the thing we're talking about. But there is another thing that happens when you hear these nonsense words where you start to associate them with.
And actually that's quite interesting, because there were instances in playing the Gostak where you're trying to figure out what certain objects or creatures are, right? And then one interesting thing that maybe is worth noting is that there is no one correct translation of the words in the Gostak, and it's basically impossible to figure out, what is this world? What are those creatures that you encounter? All you can do is in your brain create a plausible scenario, and different players might create different scenarios of what they think things are, right? And inevitably you're trying to map it onto the real world, or maybe a fantasy world or sci-fi world or whatever it might be. But it's quite interesting because there is, just to sort of go ahead, there is a creature called a gitch, right? And from the sort of what I thought the actions it was doing, but also just the fact that it was called a gitch, I couldn't help but imagine a bird. And maybe it's because gitch sounds a bit like finch. I don't know.
Yeah, but it's got that kind of. It sounds diminutive as well.
Yeah,
it sounds like a little little creature, like it's a bird or it's a rat or something. Yeah. Can I give because we talked very broadly about the game, can I just give a sort of like very bottled what I experienced or what was going through my head when we first were playing this? Because I think I bounced off of this in a particular way compared to you. You were able to finish the game, basically.
Yes.
And I wasn't. And I think the game broke for me at the moment where I realized what you were saying, which is that there isn't actually a correct answer here. And I think the game is really admirable for doing that. But it felt very unsatisfying to me at the same time. And I think like the whole conversation we just had about, what you were telling me about the root of this phrase is very telling, because this is like a language nerds game that is rooted in this language nerd discussion about like, how you can guess what things mean from context and stuff. But yeah, we start off in what we're told is the Delta of Tondam. So it's that kind of already sounds like a nested place, right? It's the thing of the thing, and it's where you are. So to me, when I think of that in the real world, it's like the center of London or the harbor of like another town. So I was immediately like drawn towards maybe it being harbor. And then we've got where Gitches Frike and Dustcats Glake. Across from atop the Kerpel, a Gomway deeves to kill off and kerf. Gom being a Semmeln to its hof. And this was one of the areas where when you first were playing this, you didn't have some of the conventions of the interactive fiction, and I did.
Yes.
So when I saw a Gomway deeves to kill off and kerf, well, first we've got deeves, which sounds like leaves. And I'm not sure it exactly is leaves, but it feels related. So, but I could see from the context and from having played these games that kill off and kerf would be directions, like cardinal directions on a compass. And if you type in kerf or kill off, you do get moved somewhere else. So, and the directions, the north, south, east, and west, have words that, and you drew a physical map for this where you were playing, right? Yeah. They have like, they write the words for left and right and north and south basically rhyme with each other. So you've got hoff and joff and herf and jerf or something like that. So you don't actually know which axis each one is. And if you draw a map, it could be completely wrongly oriented, but it doesn't really matter because...
It might be upside down, right? Yeah. Or tilted 90 degrees, but like, it doesn't matter.
It's a bit of a brain melter because it's like it doesn't matter, but you kind of want it to matter. But it basically, the rhyming words are the opposites of each other. It's like if we had east and west being called... East and west and north and south, something like that. And the compounds for northwest and southwest work the same way. So as soon as you start moving around on this map, which is quite small, you can just sort of, how to keep going in the same direction because you type the same thing, and then that the word that's being presented that has the opposite letters in is back the other way. Which is quite helpful once you realize. But yeah, like I said, you didn't know that even this convention of typing go north, go south, and basically traditional IFs have these conventions of you have the cardinal points of a compass, and then you sometimes have up and down as directions, and sometimes in and out. So I think when we reach the Sammeln, which may be a shop or some sort of location you can go into, I think it's a building.
Yeah, that's as far as I got. Direction. I know that you thought it was a shop, which is quite interesting, which is not what I got. I also didn't get the harbour one. And to be fair, a lot of my thoughts on the locations was very unspecific. It's just like it's a building, and I can't really tell what it is.
But this is the correct way to play it, right? It's what it's trying to encourage you to do, because when I imposed too rigid an idea of what I thought the place was onto it, I eventually hit a point where it was like, what? Like,
this is not how harbours work.
So we're being told that we're the Gostak. That's some sort of role or duty or job.
Yeah.
And we distim the doshes. And basically the setup is we can't distim the doshes because there are clouds here and they are crenned in, which I think means they're filling up the thing.
Stuck, placed, positioned.
Yeah. And the only time you really get any words that you categorically know what they mean in this are the verbs, right? So the words for like...
Not all of them.
Not yet. Even then, it's like hard to tell what, like... there's one of the glauds is the raskable gloud.
Yeah.
And you type in rask the gloud, and it just says
you rask
it, and it's like, oh, thanks.
Yeah.
I that doesn't, does it mean take?
It does. It does mean take.
But there, basically, you have to experiment with context, right? And this is that, like the gitch being an animal thing. The gitch does a word to you that I think sounds like watching you.
Let me think. It's the one that starts with an M.
So you're basically going around trying to find out what the word for alive is, or which things you can speak to, because there are things in the world where it's like, okay, there are 5 glauds that we have to deal with,
and one's poltive.
One of them is poltive,
and you can doge at them.
And you can doge at it, which means that you can speak to it. And I think we thought poltive might mean alive, but again, it's never full. It's very hard to. So you've got these 5 things where 4 of them appear to be inanimate objects of some sort, but one of them is something you can talk to. So if I'm trying to use my mental model of like, you're trying to do something in a harbor, you're trying to do your job, like unload the boats or something, but you can't because there's these 5 things here, and they're all inanimate objects. And I did get the impression that they were vehicles of some sort, because one of them was loaded up with like things of thing, which sounded like bales of hay or barrels of something.
Yeah.
But one of them can speak. So it's like, if you are going down the route that I tried to go down of mapping it onto a real thing to help yourself, which it's only helpful if you imagine that this is like, the movie Labyrinth or something. You can have a talking boat or a talking door or whatever this thing is.
One is magically alive or whatever, right?
Yes, but again, you're never going to get, the game's never going to go, well done. That thing you thought is a thing is that thing, because you're never, there isn't a point in the game that's asking you to do that, right?
Yeah. So it's very interesting what you said earlier, like with a lot of the words you can sort of figure out. And the interesting thing is that in this like original sentence, the Gostak distims the doshes, right? I finished it. And I've also did some reading into what other people thought certain things meant afterwards. I don't know what the Gostak is. I don't know what doshes are, and I don't know what to distim means, but I finished the game. Okay? So I know the Gostak is some kind of role that involves distimming, right? And you do that to entities that are poltive.
Yeah, which maybe means alive. And again, distim is spelled D-I-S-T. So it's not D something.
No, it's D-I-S-T-I-M. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not D. It's not like an...
not
it's
un.
not a negative prefix like un or D, or it's like its own thing that we don't know what it means. And the Gostak distims the doshes is not... I think that's one of the things about the structure of this game that makes it work, is that the thing that is stopping you from doing your job as a Gostak and distimming the doshes is something unrelated to distimming the doshes, right? So you don't spend a lot of the game working out what distimming the doshes means so you can do it. You're actually trying to get the glauds out of the way through whatever means that is. And I think
whatever glauds are.
Whatever they are. I think I managed to deal with like 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah.
But even then, they're still there. So I don't know what that meant.
Yeah.
it's so like, it's such... like I said, we can talk about it and it doesn't spoil the thing, because sitting down to try and do it is such a unique experience. Deeply frustrating for me to not have that, like, you worked out what the master metaphor is, right? And very funny as well. Like, the authorial voice of this game is very funny, in the sense that, like that thing, like you rask it. They knew exactly what they were doing when they did that, and they're playing around with your potential frustration at some of these things. And it's like linguistic slapstick, right? Which is kind of the Lewis Carroll example again of the Jabberwocky, is that kind of just goofy slapstick playing with language. And I guess, I don't know how universally known Spike Milligan is, but he did a lot of these kind of nonsense poems, like I think it's really enjoyable.
It is very funny when the as you said, the authorial voice of the game gives you feedback, and through that hints, like So one of the main things that you need to do is you can tell what's a verb very quickly, right? You look at a sentence, you can tell this is the verb. These are like nouns. And then a lot of playing it is trying to figure out what kind of verbs can I do to what kind of entities, and what does that lead to, right? And so you try out a verb on an object, and then sometimes it just tells you can't do that, or it tells you
wouldn't do that,
yeah,
right?
you
Which
wouldn't,
implies it's like some sort of social or moral thing.
Yeah,
like you'd maybe said kill the cat or something.
Yeah,
like
and
that.
it's like you wouldn't do that to the cat. That's literally what it tells you, right? Like you try doing something to the gitch that's inappropriate, and it tells you wouldn't do that to the gitch. Or it tells you the gitch wouldn't be starm of that, which I think means the gitch wouldn't be fond of that.
Yeah,
that's another one, which is very. It's cute, like okay.
Yeah, and I mean, there's already. This would be a challenging enough game if it didn't have that layer of like there is an implied social world here. There is an implied moral world where there are words that your character just wouldn't do, and that's like really, really interesting, because if you're doing this kind of language puzzle and you're only dealing with the physical world, that's like level 1 of difficulty. And when you insert like the social world and morality into it in an alien world, it's like but it does have a certain amount of a kind of affordances from our language and our culture, right? Because it's quite easy to infer that is okay. I've put this, verb the noun in, and it's telling me I wouldn't do that. So that probably means kill the thing that shouldn't be killed, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's one creature you can't you can talk to, which is the what is it called? Let me look at my notes. The
droke.
The droke, yes. Yeah. Who and you can't zonk the droke, right? Which I think means kill. And partially it's so that you can finish the game, because the thing is you can ask the droke about a lot of locations and objects, and he will give you, or they will give you information.
Yeah, the droke has a lot of opinions and wants to explain things. Yeah, which is why it's easy to gender them.
Yeah. He droke explains. Which is good, because you learn a lot of words and a lot of context that can then help you to sort out the little puzzles that you need to do. But you can't. The point is, obviously, part of not being able to kill him also is because you wouldn't be able to finish the game.
But it's interesting because it gives you another mode to receive the language in, because the droke is written as a subjective character with opinions. Yeah. So there's lots of like exclamations in how
and
the
lots
droke
of
speaks.
Adjectives. He uses loads of adjectives,
which is kind of like noise to signal, right? Because like when I was playing this, I was making a dictionary of like verbs and nouns and then putting guesses next to them. But then there's certain words that come up and it's just like, this only comes up once. It doesn't seem to be functionally important for me to advance in the game.
Having said that, you also didn't get very far in the game too.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly.
You touched on how did we practically go about playing it, and again we played it separately. I played it before Joe played it, and just for days I was muttering nonsense sentences at him.
One of the things I've been thinking about, because if you compare this to Heaven's Vault.
Which if you haven't heard us talk about that, then go back to our episode 2. Yes,
it was episode 2, which it's another translation game, right? But I think one of the things we noticed then is that the language there is still structurally English in terms of like
the syntax.
The syntax of the language. So like if you are speaking French, then you put the adjective before a noun that you're describing, right?
Not always.
Okay, I thought you did often. So you would say if you were saying a little. No, the other way around. That's how we do it in English.
It depends on the adjective. Yeah. You can have them, I think, either before or after.
Yeah. But that's an example, right? But the language that you're deciphering in Heaven's Vault is in the same word order as English, even though it's an alien language. And then the way the actual words are formed is kind of the puzzle. And playing that and then playing this sort of made me think about how you design these sorts of games. Is there has to be some sort of there has to be some part of the language that is recognizable to us that for us to start from, right? And that's what this game is doing. It's like, even in the introduction where it's saying, it takes the structural norms of an interactive fiction, and there's even a sentence that basically says, it says for a hint, type hint, but it's done in the language of the game, right? And this was one of those things where, again, you didn't know about hint systems in these games.
No.
So didn't know what that meant.
So right at the beginning, when it goes, finally, here you are, blah, 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 you're meant to distinct the doshes. And then it says the Gostak, an Often which means an interactive fiction or fiction game. Copyright by Carl Muckenhoupt. And then it says for Jalen Lauk Jalen. And I just ignored that for the longest time.
And it's not a normal hint system as well. It's quite an in-depth sort of mini encyclopedia.
And here's the other thing. It's written with the nonsense words. Yes. So you can click on it and then it'll give you a guide on how to doge, but it'll literally be like, to doge at Poltiv so-and-so's. And then it's written in that, which makes it it took me a long time to be like, oh, what does that at the beginning mean here? And then I typed it in and I was like, my God, I can't believe it.
So this is a language game for language nerds. It has like even the thematics of it. And I really like the way it's titled as well, because it's like we said, we don't know what the Gostak is even after playing it.
Yeah.
We know it's some sort of role. We don't know if there's one of them or if there's many.
One of the things I sort of had in mind, I thought like pest control, something like that, right? But I don't know.
Yeah, but I love that it's the title, because it kind of, if there was a correct answer, this is a game that could be called like The Knight or The Janitor, or it's someone's job role as the title of the game, but we still don't know what it means.
Yeah.
So like do you think that being a linguist made this game easier to play?
Well, maybe easier in the sense that I am more inclined to sit down and work out a silly language puzzle than the average player. Like I was quite, maybe it was part of like the linguist's honor of like, I'm not going to give up and I'm gonna finish this. Whereas you at some point were like, I cannot do it.
Yeah, I really admire what this is doing, but it's hurting me. Kind of thing. It was more the fact that I've seen people talk about this with puzzle games in general, with streaming and like embarrassment. And one of the things that is going around in the indie games community at the moment is like, don't make a really hard puzzle game because it will make streamers feel stupid in front of their audience and then they won't want to play it, which is really interesting, because I was feeling that on like a micro level of just like the way the game, it was making me feel stupid in a way that I wasn't enjoying.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you were able to come up with some methods for working out how things fit together that I might not have had access to.
And I don't think that you need to be a linguist to do this, but I just had the sort of meta awareness of realizing what I was doing as I was doing it. And one of it is trying to figure out what's called the transitivity of verbs.
Okay.
So transitivity means what kind of objects, if any at all, can a verb take. So if you have a verb in a sentence, right, you have a sentence has at least a subject and a verb, right?
Yeah.
So if I have a sentence like I cry, I am the subject and crying is the verb, and it describes something.
You can cry at something, right? But you can also just cry on its own.
Exactly.
Which some verbs you might not be able to.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then I can read a book, right? Where the book is the direct object.
Yeah, you're doing the verb to the object.
Book. Yeah. Or I can give the book to Joe, where I have the direct object, the book, and the indirect object, Joe, right? So I cry would be an intransitive use of a verb.
So transitive, like transporting, and intransitive, it doesn't go anywhere. So I cry is just the crying stays there.
Sure. Yeah? So I cry is intransitive. I read the book is monotransitive. It has one object. And I give the book to Joe is ditransitive. It has a direct and an indirect object.
Yep, that makes sense.
So one of the things I was doing for a lot of time, I just literally had like scribbled down all the verbs that I could find, and I would just type those in on their own to see if anything happened. And if they could be used monotransitively, the game would tell you, for instance, who do you want to doge at, right?
Yeah.
So then it prompts you to put an object in.
Yeah. So I give a good example of this, which kind of relates back to the conventions of the genre.
Yeah.
Most of these parser-based IFs have look and they have examine. And you can just walk into a room and say, look, and it'll say, you are in the lounge. There is a piano. There is a table.
Yeah.
But if you walked into a room and said examine, it would say, what do you want to examine? And that we did have two words.
Although you also look at something, right?
Yes. So we did.
Grammar-wise, they are look at and examine are the same in that they would take an object. It's just if you just type look, it'll put in automatically the environment that you are in as the thing that you are looking at.
Which was the one that I think took us. Certainly I took.
It took you a long time to figure out. Yeah.
And but it was like it took me a while to clock it, and then once I realised, I kind of thought back to that convention of the genre and. That you have look, it's kind of like doing a passive perception thing in D&D where it's just like you notice what you notice, whereas examining is like actively looking at a specific thing to try and get more information about it. So in that case, the look can be used as an intransitive. You just do it without applying it to anything. But the examine is only ever used. The examine is only ever used as a transitive. You have to follow it up with a noun that you want to examine. Like examine the gibberish or whatever. Yeah.
And then obviously once you figure out, okay, I need, say, a direct object, right? I need something that I do this action to. Then, you know, the next step is figuring out what is the group of objects that I can do this to. And, you know, what do they have in common? What are some features? And one of the things is, you know, you can only distim something that's poltive. You can only doge at something that's poltive, right? And that's how we got to, or maybe poltive means alive because that's what you can communicate with.
Yes.
Although
the gitches are poltive, but if you doge at them, they don't doge back.
No, they only do a thing which is maybe
stare at you,
make a noise. I think there is one that's like they do some kind of noise.
They warb.
No, like warb is another creature.
Okay.
Yeah, so and interesting. So while I was playing it, I was really, really trying not to get stuck on one reading of the whole game. And so I kept thinking, okay, what might be alternatives, right? So poltive might be alive, but then I thought it might also be like activated or
just friendly,
sentient.
Right? It could be sentient, but it could also be friendly because you can get characters that won't talk to you just because
it can't be friendly because there are things that you can talk to who are clearly not friendly to you. You never met the dog cat.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't.
No, you didn't meet the dog cat. Delcat? What's it called? Delcat. No, what's it called? I can't remember.
It definitely doesn't matter at this stage.
So working out certain like grammatical structures of objects, direct objects, indirect objects, and then doing a sort of analysis of characteristics that certain things have in common to figure out groups of things and, you know, how are things related, who can do what to whom. There's also verbs that you can't do, for instance, right? So at the very beginning of the game, again, it tells you that the Delcod of Tondem is where Doshes Steve and Gitches Frike. And then if you try to Frike, it tells you are no Gitch.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can't.
It again kind of makes you think maybe it's a bird, maybe that means swoop or fly or something.
Yeah. But who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, you're never gonna know.
Yeah.
It is fascinating, and I know that the way we've described it makes it sound very language centric, but one of the first things you learn if you do like a game design 101 course is to do with nouns and verbs. And like even at university level, you'll often find you've got students come in, maybe they're from another country where they have different like culture of learning languages, or maybe they're just from an English school that didn't do like, because our curriculum, at least when I went to school, we did English in 2 segments. We do literature and then we do English language, which is all of this kind of, it's basically basic linguistics. And sometimes students come in at 18 and they don't actually know what a verb or a noun is, so they get muddled up. But a lot of game design stuff is thinking of things as verbs and nouns, both at the game design level and also what you have to do when you program games, right? We have, there is a pattern in programming that's been dominant for about 20 years called object-oriented programming, which basically means like everything moving around in your game is its own object, and there might be some hidden objects, and they are all running their own little scripts. Whereas if you go back 40 years, the entire game is one big script that needs to account for everything. And I think often some of the games that have come at some of the richest gameplay are about these relationships between verbs and nouns, and how many verbs work on so many different nouns. So recently, you and I have been playing Prey. So 2017, I think it came out in this like space horror, survival-y, weird alien. It's in a genre called immersive sims.
Not material for this podcast.
Not normally, no, but it's a good example of kind of what I want to briefly touch on, which is, if you have like an action game or something and lots of verbs work differently on lots of nouns, you often end up with a really rich game that you can get loads of emergent play out of. So if you take, for example, in that game, the way electricity interacts with lots of different things, right? So if you turn that into a verb and say zap, right? Right, you can zap an enemy. An enemy can zap things, and zapping can also cause other things to happen. Like we had an issue where we had an alien who was our friend who we'd summoned, and he was zapping everywhere, and fixed this panel on the wall that was previously zapping. And whenever the alien walked past it, he would like re-break it.
Yeah.
And that's an example of like where you get like really rich interactions in a game by having lots of nouns and verbs that work together. So although obviously everything we've been speaking about in relation to this game is from a very text-heavy game, there is this long-standing thing in game design of thinking of games as nouns and the verbs that players can do to them, or nouns and the verbs that they can do to players or they can do to each other. And I think this is a game that is very helpful for people who want to design games to play, even if this like language puzzle thing is kind of, don't want to do that.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting thing to experience, and it's such a good, it gives you such a good experience of being alienated as well. Like if you just, even getting away from the puzzle, it really feels like, you know, being in a foreign country and being out of your depth, and people coming up to you and talking to you and not knowing that you're not from there and stuff, you know, which is, I thought something we don't often get to experience in games.
When you had a bit of French at school and you go to France and you don't remember what the words mean and you're trying to figure out from the context what the sign is saying. It's sort of like that.
Yeah, which is a really interesting thing to experience in a game, because I don't think we get much of that. Even when games are ostensibly about going to a strange alien place, we still have universes where everyone miraculously speaks the same language and all of that kind of stuff. I do remember the very first time I was asked to translate something in a video game like this was there's a game came out in the early 90s called Ultima Underworld, and there's a sequence in it where you find a prisoner that's being held by these lizard men, and all of the text is written, you know, there's no voiceover, and then it occasionally has like stage directions of like, this prisoner has had his tongue cut out, and you go and you talk to the lizards in the community, and they say stuff, they make different noises, and it's all written out phonetically. Like they hiss and then chirrup and da-da-da. And then you go back to the prisoner, and he's obviously been a prisoner there for ages, sitting there with his tongue cut out. And you talk to him, and you gradually piece together the language of the lizard people by saying words to him, and then he mimes them. Right? So it's written out like what his mime is.
Okay.
And then, and again, it was one of these games where you have to have your own little notepad, because you just won't be able to do it otherwise. Yeah, it's definitely something people have been playing around with this kind of stuff since since we've had games. And I think we used to get more of it because games used to be a lot more based around text rather than having characters speak like audibly.
Yeah. I found it very enjoyable. It did also hurt my brain a little bit, but I enjoyed it a lot. Yeah.
I hope people play it. I hope some of the people that listen to this go and play it because, like I said, I don't think we've spoiled it in particular.
No.
I might play it again at some point on a stream because I think it's a very funny game to watch someone else get confused by and embarrassed about and stuff. Yeah. But yeah, I really enjoy that one. If this is the first episode of this podcast you've listened to, then we're on episode 7 now. We're on episode 6. Welcome. Thank you for clicking on this on whatever platform you're on. If you like what you heard, then please do give us a positive review on Spotify or Apple or wherever you're listening to your podcast, because that helps us get visibility.
Please subscribe. We are now also available on YouTube, by the way. We have a YouTube channel called Say It Like You Play It, where you can listen to our podcast and have some background image in addition to our voices. We also have our blog, which accompanies the podcast, where we have an episode, a blog post for every episode, where we go a little bit in depth on certain issues. So it's not exactly the same content. It's usually taking a more in-depth look at a specific issue.
Yes, it's an accompaniment, isn't it, rather than like word for word show notes. So if there is like a reference that we talk about in the podcast that you want to find, it's usually going to be on the blog, but the blog may sometimes have side discussions or things that we didn't talk about here because it's a different format and it accommodates different things.
And if you like our content and would like to support us, then you can do so. We have a Buy Me a Coffee account. It's also going to be in the description. You can buy us a coffee.
Yeah, that would be nice. I would like a coffee. I haven't had one today, so we need to get this podcast out quickly so that someone can buy us a coffee today. Otherwise, I have to wait till tomorrow.
That would be great.
Yeah, thanks for listening. We've been Dr. Ibby and Dr. Joe. This is Say It Like You Play It, the podcast about games, languages, and culture.
See you next time.
No. Let's stand up.